However, this is like still only capable of detecting relatively later stages of the calcification. And luckily, the high resolution micro-CT has been like become a thing and has been used for the microcalcification detection in the breast. And this group right here designed a micro-CT scanner for breast CT using a flat panel detector and using the FeldCam algorithm with Chapeau-Logan kernel for all the risk construction. And they are interested in, as they are interested in the breast microcalcifications, and they use a stable kind of phantom for all the testing and evaluations. So there's like no motion in this model, and they did not consider it. So we wanted to take a look at the effect of coronary motion during the imaging process and how that affects on the detectability of the coronary calcification. And just to help explaining the project better, I will start with an introduction of the CT, or maybe I should say like it's like a review of what we learned about CT in the class. And here's the X-ray tube. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but like on the upper left, which is like is point B, there's like a X-ray source, like usually a X-ray tube, and that's like where the X-ray comes out of from. And this like on the other side of that is like the detector of the CT machine. The patient will like cast a shadow on the detector, and depends on the density and thickness of the tissue, the amount of X-ray comes through is like different. So the X-ray intensity being collected on the detector will be like different as well. As we can see, like underneath here, there's like a little graph of like different intensity for different tissue. And the source and detector will like rotate around the patient a little bit, so we can we can like have the image on a different angle. If you look at this like animation on the right hand side, we can like have like a super clear understanding of this. And while the source and detector is like spinning around the patient also will be like sent deeper into the machine, which is like a movement on the Z direction or like the head foot direction. So like in this way, this particular one is a spiral motion. So you have like a measurement for both angular views and the different location on Z axis. And for the cardiac imaging, it's like more preferable to like use the step and stool scan instead of like this. I don't have the image here, but like the idea is that like instead of like having the continuous motion on the Z-axis, we do it like slice by slice. And like the Z-axis image would be like taking at each step, and it only moves to the next step after the entire like revolution of the source and detector is like finished. Then you move to this next step. So it's like making slices on the human body. And after taking the this one, sorry for the funky GIF. It only works when you refresh the page. I don't know how to fix it, but that's the idea. After taking the measurement, we need to reconstruct the CT. Come on. So after taking the measurements, we need to reconstruct the CT image. And like here is like the on the leftmost image is like showing like where the location of the beam is, like which angle is like measured at. And like the second image here is like it's the inverse of the X-ray intensity along the line of the detector. Like the higher value means like brighter in the picture, but actually means less X-ray pass through, or I guess you can call it like more X-ray attenuation is there. And so if we look at the I'll let the drift play again. So if I look at the right-hand most picture here, like at each angle, like this value is like projected back into the image space, and we call this back projection. And the problem here is that like when we rotate the projection and go like on a 360 degree to finish the entire reconstruction, the image is like just like too noisy and it's like super blurry. When there's like a noise like this, we need to filter to get the image that we want to become the third picture here. So what we have to do here is like to apply the filter to the data in the Fourier space. And the reason is that like when we take the projections at an angle, the Fourier transform of the projection is like a sampling through the origin of the Fourier transform of the 2D object. And when we take multiple projections, we are doing the polar sampling of the Fourier component of the object. And if we do not apply the filter, we get like a blurring effect on the object and like overweighting the low frequency on the data, as we can kind of see here, like the low frequency part of the Fourier space is just like super high, and like the filter is kind of just like weighting the higher frequency more and the lower frequency less. And the filters, there are some different kind of filters that's like commonly used here. Is like Ramlak, Chaplogin, cosine, Hamming, and they are like all weighting the different frequency like in a different way, and they have different results. That's not like the important. That's not we are focusing here on this project, but like that's just the basic idea of the filters. And the CT number. The CT number, you all should be really familiar with this part. As you can see, I like literally just took all the equation and the image from the lecture slides. Basically, the X-ray attenuation is different on different kind of tissue, and this CT number is just to make an attenuation map relative to water and air, as the value for this two is like already known, and that's what's like being used to calibrate the machine daily. And in the image here on the right-hand side, we can see like all these like different parts have different CT numbers, like bone is 750, fat is like -120, and like calcification here is like 1300. And like with these different CT numbers, we can identify the calcification or like other structures based on a different level of the CT number. Dilation and erosion. So these two are the most basic morphological operations, and dilation adds the pixels to the boundaries of the objects in the image, and the erosion removes pixels on the object boundaries. And the number of pixels being added or removed from the original object in the image is kind of like solely depends on the size and the shape of the structuring element that's being used to process the image. In the dilation and erosion operation, the state of every pixel in the output image is like kind of determined by applying a certain corresponding rule to the corresponding pixel and like its neighboring pixels in the input image. And the rule used to process the pixels defines the operation as dilation or erosion. And just like a quick run through of the rule for dilation, the value of the output pixel is the maximum value of all pixels in the neighborhood. So if it's a binary image, if one pixel is set to 1, so in the binary image, if any of the neighboring pixel has a value of 1, a pixel is set to 1. And for the dilation operation, it makes object more visible and fills in small holes in the objects. Lines of the image just like appear to be thicker, and the field shape just looks larger. And for erosion, the value of the output pixel is the maximum value of all the pixels in the neighborhood. So in the binary image, a pixel is set to 0 if any of the neighboring pixels have the value of 0. So the erosion removes floating pixels and make the lines thinner, so the only substantive objects remain on the image. And these, like, as we can compare from the left to right, the like remaining lines are thinner and the shapes are just like appear to be smaller. And we will talk the erosion and dilation is like mostly to be used for masking our result, and my teammate will talk about more later.
Yeah, let me present my screen. So, yeah. So this is the workflow of our whole work, like just summarize. So first we start with designing a 3D phantom, and to which we add a linear translation in order to incorporate the noise. Then we take a forward projection and get the sinogram, and then we do the image reconstruction, backward projection, and then we apply morphological operation to get the calcification mask and detect the calcification. And I'm going to go in details of what is being done. So first, we start with the digital coronary phantom design, in which we design the 3D coronary vessel phantom, which is oriented in the Z direction. And yes, which had 7 identical cylindrical coronary vessels at different radial positions between 2.5 mm to 7 mm from the isocenter. So like we have different phantoms with different radial positions, diameters, and calcification ratio. And the calcification points have been randomly chosen. So this is a this is the 2-dimensional view of it, like of the yeah. So then, like, the vessel phantom has been oversampled in our code. We have used just a factor of 4 in X and Y direction to calculate the projection, because we are doing just a simple simulation, and due to my system limitation, but we couldn't emulate what's done in practice, like oversampling by a factor of 16 in X and Y direction, which is a more accurate projection for like standard clinical detector geometry. So like, yeah. And then to introduce motion during the data acquisition, linear translation has been applied, given by this formula. I don't know if my cursor is actually visible or not. Yeah, so like the total targeted distance and this traveling in horizontal direction over a course of 800 projections, and we are spanning over a 360 degrees sampling of the object. So there is a 360 degree sampling, and we are simulating in the like the motion in the range from 0 to 2 millimeter. And then for each time point in the range of this 800 projections, we are doing a forward projection for the phantom, and we are obtaining our sinograms. And then we are like performing the 360 degree reconstruction. So like before we go to that, we can see that when we apply our motion translation, the most affected phantoms are this phantom 6 and 7, which were small pixels initially, and we can see these are mostly affected, and the rest are like kind of not affected. Here we have used like 1.2 millimeter motion for this picture, like for the simulation, sorry. Yeah, so then we used like the different reconstruction filters, like we have explored here Shep-Logan and Ramlak and Hamming and Hanning. So like we have Ramlak is mostly used in practice in CT, as it provides a good balance between spatial resolution and noise suppression, and it has a capability of resulting in sharper images even at high noise level. While Shep-Logan, whose results we can see here, is used in like a Fourier-based reconstruction algorithm, and it reduces artifacts but introduces blurring, as we can see here. Then,
can I ask a quick question?
yes, Professor.
For Phantom 6 and Phantom 7,
Yes.
if there was no motion artifact, what does the image look like?
Okay, so without the motion, it was like this.
I see. Okay, let me see in Phantom 6. And so Phantom 7 is like a 2x2 box or something, or a...
Yes, it's just 1 pixel wide.
Oh, 1 pixel box. Okay. Phantom 4. And then why does Phantom 2 have basically some blue and some yellow inside the circle.
So for this, we were just trying to see, have calcification at some points and not the whole area.
Oh, I see. So this is, in
Right.
fact, I see. So you have a mixture
Yes.
of positive and negative calls inside.
Yes.
Oh, got it. All right, now I got it. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, and if you go to the next slide with the small motion, all of that fills in.
Yes.
Right? And then down at the linear, for the single pixel, it just blurs across a few pixels. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes. So yeah, this was a ramp-like reconstruction which we got, and this is the Hanning reconstruction which we saw. So the Hanning filter is the closest resemblance to what's used in the clinical scanners. So after getting our reconstruction results, we performed dilation and erosion, that is the morphological reconstruction methods, which are mostly used for creating image masks in the traditional image processing. So we used that to detect the areas of our calcification, and these were our detected areas which we got using our masks. And yeah, here we can see Phantom 7 and also Phantom 6 are very different from whatever we had originally passed. But for Phantom 1 or 2, it's almost like our initial images. Here we have just used our dilation and erosion for the mask, but if we use machine learning algorithms, probably they will perform a lot better in the detection. And to quantify our results, we have used the SNR, which is the ratio between the maximum possible power of signal to power of distorting noise, and structural similarity, which is the perceptual metric which quantifies the image quality of degradation. What we see here for Phantom 7 might be misleading because Phantom 7 was just a very small area where there was calcification. So it might be possible that because the background is all the same, so this SNR and SSIM are very high, but it doesn't replicate the actual result which we see because we need to look at the small area. And so for these were the results which we got when we used the threshold for 0.3 for our masking. And so because of system limit, yes, Professor.
So when you're doing the SNR here,
yes,
this is basically only signal amplitude you're measuring, because there is, as far as I can tell, there's no noise in the simulation.
Yes.
Okay, so it's basically just S.
Yes,
like how the signal goes up.
Because the motion might introduce some noise. So there might be some noise.
I see.
The motion.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. And so this was just a simple simulation which we did. Also, due to our system limitation, we couldn't explore what's done in practical clinical scanners, like the oversampling and everything by a higher factor. But I hope this will be like a starting step to something which we can do in future, like maybe utilize machine learning approaches or some other approaches. And these were our references.
Okay, great. Thanks. Are there any questions from the class, from the group, in terms of? If not, I have a couple of questions. If you go back to your motion model, so this is our first, this is the image that has motion blur on it when you moved it 1.2 millimeters. Is that correct? So How big is a pixel? In terms of millimeters?
The pixels should be, each pixels are 1 pixel wide. So it's like 1 centimeter, I think.
It's probably 1 millimeter, you mean?
Yeah, 1 millimeter, sorry.
Okay, so you have a 1 by 1 millimeter pixel, and you're
Yes.
moving over the course of your 180 or your 360 degrees, you're moving.
In 360 degrees.
Okay, and then you move 1 whole pixel or 1.2 pixels.
Yes.
During that acquisition, and this is the resulting artifact. Okay, and then what you're measuring in your performance is how the signal amplitude of those pixels there change post motion. So if you go to your results where you have that table at the end here,
Yes.
so this it's Phantom 7, 30 dB, SSIM 0.98. So it doesn't look like you lose, who knows? Did you lose signal or gain signal? I don't know what happened here.
Yeah, like we felt if we look at, so this was for the Hanning filter.
Yeah.
So we look at the Hanning. So we feel that we gained some pixels.
Yeah, well, you certainly gain some pixels in the sense that the distribution of signals is across a lot more pixels, right?
Yes.
So I guess the question is, did this actually amplify the signal, right? I mean, you know, you know, it might even be easier to detect after this, is my question. Like, is it harder to detect one after it's moved or easier to detect after it's moved?
So in this case, it was like easier to detect after it's moved, but it might be possible because of the morphological operation which we did, because the dilation and erosion add the pixel and then remove it in some way. So that might be the reason.
Okay.
Yeah, and another thing is like if the motion is like just took place in the middle of the revolution of the scanner and the detector and the source, it's might measure like a higher intensity or like less attenuation. So there's like a slightly lower CT number on that. So it could be misleading if that's the case.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, thanks for doing that simulation. I think, so we're at 8:25. So if you guys don't mind, we could, you know, move ahead. And in case somebody goes a little long, it'll keep us on time. Let me see where we are here. Who's next? So Daniela, you're next. Exploring biochemistry of the nuclear medicine tracers.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I thought I was going third.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
let me see. Oh,
I
sorry,
mean,
it's 8:30. I thought it was 9 o'clock. My bad.
no, it's okay.
Yeah.
And it doesn't particularly matter, but yeah, all right.
Yeah, okay. Let's stay on track here. So it should be Yisa Lee on deep learning based whole heart segmentation is who's second here. Okay. Yisa, are you ready to take the
Oh yeah, just a second,
reins?
please.
Okay. Okay, that looks good. It's filled up my screen.
Okay. Okay, I'll start. First of all, because I'm having a severe cold right now, so my voice is really not good. So sorry
That's
about
okay.
that.
You can speak very quietly and take frequent drinks if you'd like.
Okay.
I went through this at the beginning of the course. It's not happy. It's not a happy.
Okay. So today I'm gonna present about deep learning, which is convolutional neural network based whole heart segmentation in cardiac CT. So in recent years, increased number of people are dying from cardiovascular disease globally. Medical imaging has revolutionized modern medicine and healthcare, and imaging and computer techniques have become increasingly important for the diagnosis and treatment of cardiovascular disease. So especially CT and MRI are particularly used to provide clear anatomical information about heart. So to quantify the morphological and pathological changes, it is commonly a prerequisite to segment the important structures of the cardiomedical images. So whole heart segmentation aims to extract each of the individual whole heart substructures, including left ventricle, left atrium, right atrium, myocardium of LV, ascending aorta, or the whole aorta, and the pulmonary artery. So the application of whole heart segmentation are numerous. The results can be used to directly compute the functional indices such as ejection function, and also the geometric information is useful in surgical guidance such as in radiofrequency ablation of LA. However, the manual delineation of whole heart is labor intensive and tedious, needing almost 8 hours for a single subject.
Can I ask you a question?
Oh, yeah.
It would be awesome. I'm assuming you got this illustration from a paper or something?
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you all to send me your slides, but before you send me your slides, could you put just at the bottom, a citation of where the illustration came from?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I put all of the citation in the last page.
Oh, okay. Then you could just put a number here,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
from paper 1 in the citations or something like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
So does just a moment, please. Thus, automating the segmentation from multimodality images is highly desired but still challenging, mainly due to following reasons. First, the shape of the heart varies through the cardiac cycle as heart contracts and relaxes. It also varies greatly from subject to subject, especially for those with pathological and physiological changes. Second, the appearance of the image quality can be variable. For example, the enhancement patterns of the CT images can differ significantly for different scanners or acquisition sessions. Also, motion artifacts, poor contrast to noise ratio, and signal to noise ratio commonly presented in the clinical data can significantly deteriorate the image quality and challenge the task. So a variety of computerized methods have been proposed, and there is roughly 2 methodologies. So first one is a traditional segmentation method, which is a registration-based, model-based approaches. They usually have high precision and generally achieve ideal segmentation results but the algorithms are not robust enough and often produce unsatisfactory segmentation results when the data quality is poor. And second, for the convolutional neural network-based segmentation method, they require a large, they are relatively more robust than the traditional method for the various type of data, but they require a large amount of annotated data, which limits their applicability to medical segmentation area. So therefore, the segmentation method of using convolutional neural network, the UNet model successfully solved the problem of inadequate medical image training labels. The UNet architecture consists of a contraction path and an expanding path, which maximizes the use of annotated data so that the network can train a better network model with fewer images. Also, the UNet and improved version of UNet are widely used in various medical image processing applications, such as retinal blood vessel segmentation, brain tumor detection, and also heart segmentation too. And in addition, 3D UNet, an improvement of 2D UNet, is also applied to whole heart segmentation task, but because of the limitation of GPU memory, it is necessary to perform downsample or block training during network training, which ultimately leads to insufficient accurate segmentation results. So the goal of this project is to validate deep convolutional neural network algorithm to segment whole heart substructure using proposed network based on UNet and using cardiac CT. Also, I'll use effective thresholding method to remove noise from cardiac CT without losing information from ROI, which allows to enhance segmentation accuracy. So this is a two-step UNet architecture, which I'm gonna use in this project. And so the reason why I use this two-step UNet architecture is because that it is difficult to segment the heart data directly, because the heart data needs to be divided into 8 categories, like LV and myocardium RV. So I'll use this two-stage UNet framework, which consists of whole heart segmentation part and heart substructure segmentation part. Each stage includes just a binary classification task. So the main purpose of the first stage is to segment the whole heart substructure, which is our ROI. So the corresponding ROI, like this mask, we'll use this mask in here to segment our ROI. And we use UNet again to segment the 7 heart substructures.
Can I ask a quick question?
Okay.
So I've seen 2 stages done before with a number of examples in order to essentially fill the volume with the same amount of heart versus background, right?
Yeah, right.
So that you don't have a huge imbalance between background and heart, and that imbalance is fairly consistent from one patient to the next. It seems here you've taken an extra step. This mask, you know, isn't just a sort of an ellipse around a region that is a volume of a heart. It actually has partial segmentation already done, right? And that there's interdigitated with the mask is stuff you're not going to call heart, but is definitely inside, you know, of the heart region. So that's interesting. I mean, why did you decide to do that as opposed to just make a box that was the heart? for stage 1?
Because first, I just want to localize the ROI first, and the label of the data is provided with the exact contour of all hard substructures. So yeah, I use those label and convert those label into a binary mask and make the contour more precise, like using the image processing techniques such as the OpenCV libraries. So,
Okay, I got it. So basically, since you had one set of labels, you use those labels, but you combine all the labels together as one single label called heart, and then use that. Okay.
yeah.
Interesting. All right. Great.
Yeah, okay. So this is the network architecture that I use. And for the image processing step, before I use the input as cardiac CT as my input, I use stress sorting segmentation task first. So voxels of different tissues in medical images often appears as different intensity values. The threshold can directly remove the uninteresting parts and reduce noise inference. So this procedure is necessary and effective before the segmentation task. So next I need to select the threshold value. The selection of threshold value is really crucial step to segment our ROI and remove the noise from the background. And if the threshold range is too small, the region of interest will be affected, leading to a low accuracy. And in contrast, if the threshold range is too large, noise reduction will not be achieved. So using the labels of whole hearts or each substructures, the corresponding voxels in the original data can be collected into a specific set. And I set the cutting threshold as minimum of a set A and maximum of set A. I also do this task using the provided label data. So these are the values I used for the thresholding task.
So can I ask a question? So it says myocardial minimum was down around minus 200 plus or minus 100 or something. And I'm not sure why would myocardium ever have Hounsfield unit values that are way down there? I guess I don't get that. This is.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I just box plot using the labels. Oh, yeah, I'll check that part too.
It seems that
yeah,
all of these ones that are the minima, the Hounsfield unit values seem really low. Does it include those images that have, say, streak artifacts or any kind of artifact that is contained inside that tissue as well, like your LV, minimum or your myocardial minimum, for example? I guess it's mixing with fat, maybe. Is that why that would be happening?
Yeah, maybe, but I don't have a clinical information about the patients. So
which data are you using as your labeled data? Where'd you get it?
This is multimodality whole heart segmentation task data.
And that was like a challenge or something in the data?
Oh, yeah, right. That's a challenge data, and just CT data and label is provided, and I cannot see the patient information.
Okay.
Yeah.
And okay, that's cool. And do you cite that in your references as well, where the data came from, how to get it?
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Okay. Okay, well,
Oh,
still a
okay.
mystery then.
So for the experimental settings, experiments were performed on 20 data set from MMWHS Challenge 2017 with resolution in the axial direction of 0.78 millimeters. The data set were collected in vivo clinical environments with various image qualities. So using some of extremely poor quality data will ensure the robustness of the proposed approach. The language that I mainly used is Python, and I use PyTorch library to training the model. And I also use 5-fold cross-validation and divide the 20 CT data into 16 training data and 4 validation data. For the criteria methodology, I use dissimilarity coefficient, DSC metrics, and in here, I have auto as our segmentation result, and F manual is provided manual label. So there is a 7 substructures I need to classify. So I measure this matrix for all of these 7 structures. And these are the result table of my experiments, and it can be seen from first table that which is the DSC results of whole heart segmentation, and second table is DSC result of heart substructure segmentations. So for example, the DSC score of ascending artery, which is 0.9, which outperform DSC scores of conventional unit heart segmentation algorithm. This unit segmentation algorithm is just without 2-step framework, just directly segment the 7 heart structures. However, the DSC score of RA is only 0.67, and the segmentation result is unsatisfactory and needs to be improved. The reason for this result is that some slices along the axial plane have a large number of heart substructures, such as right atrium and right ventricle. So too many organizational structures make it easy for the errors to enter into the network training, which affects the segmentation accuracy. However, for the slice near the main ascending artery has some simple structures. And these are the visualization result of my project. And this is the original CT, the left one is original CT image. And this is the label image, which is provided. And this is the segmentation result of whole heart segmentation. And this is the segmentation result of the second stage, which is right ventricle. And this is the segmentation result of ascending artery. So for conclusion, 2D segmentation, image segmentation, I proposed 2D image segmentation strategy that relies on 2-stage unit framework to segment the whole heart and its substructures. And second, image pre-processing step for the original data is effective in building the training data set for classification system. And for the future work, since it outperforms than the conventional UNet, but it's still not state of art. So we can use another technology, another strategy to improve our accuracy. And I think we can analyze in different orientation slices, not rather than the axial slices. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, cool. And so do you have a slide after this that gives all the citations?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So you have all that. All right. So it'd be great if you can tie those to the pictures you used. So if you go back to the table of your dice coefficients, what we have here, and then the results.
Oh, here.
Okay, so these guys. So in the case even of the two-step UNet, when you look at your segmentation map, so you're getting relatively low dice in, say, the right atrium, right?
Yeah, right.
And when you look at how it fails, is it mistaking the left atrium for right atrium? Is it mistaking background for right atrium? What are is there sort of a general rule for how these things are failing? Do you know?
Oh, yeah, they usually just segment as a background.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So it basically doesn't fill out the right atrium. It leaves some as the background.
Yeah, right.
I see. Okay. And I mean, 16 images isn't a lot to train on, right? Especially when you have 2, 4, 6, 7 objects, right? So
Yeah, right.
it's a lot of labels for 16 images, right? So it might be a little bit tricky. Do you think it matters that you're doing all the labels? If you tried to train this just to 2 LV volume and that's all you trained it, would it do better than this 0.79?
Yeah, I think.
It might.
Yeah, it might.
I don't know personally.
Mm.
Okay, and then the other question I have, so I'm a little confused as to whether or not the images you're using are all 2D, and then you do multiple images per patient, or is this process being done in 3D? Is the convolution done in 3D?
It's all 2D network, but the
Okay.
original image is provided in 3D too.
So then you cut out
the
slices.
slices. Yeah.
And you cut those out with no specific orientation. It was just the axial slices.
Yeah, just axial slices.
I see. Okay. Yeah. And then you would just pile in all of the slices from one patient.
Yeah, right.
Okay. And then, but you would keep all the slices from one patient together if they were being held out.
Oh, yeah, I tried to divide the data set into per patient.
Okay. It's interesting. I don't know why the performance is not great, right? So I wonder if you did this on, say, 100 cases, it would just get better, you know.
Yeah. Oh, I heard there is more, like 40 more data if I send some like something like certification things and send email to the provider. Yeah.
Oh, to get more of these cases?
Yeah, but I didn't do that.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
because I really lack of the GPU memory and something like that.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I guess the group that made this challenge in 2017 continues to grow the data set? And so there's
Yeah,
more.
I heard those 40 data set is from test data. They
Okay.
they just reveal the test data set too.
Okay, cool. All right, well, thank you very much. Great. Are there questions from the class on this implementation? Okay. And sorry about your cold, and you made it through. Sorry to put you through that. Okay. All right, let's keep on rolling, I guess. While it is not 9 o'clock yet, Daniela, shall we get going on yours? We'll stay ahead of schedule here.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, terrific.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. So hi, I'm Daniela, and today I'm going to be giving you guys a detailed look at the biochemistry of radio tracers for nuclear medicine, specifically tracers designed for PET cardiac imaging. As we learned in class, nuclear medicine involves two modalities, SPECT and PET. Generally speaking, both of these use some kind of radioactive tracer that's injected into the patient. This tracer gets taken up by body tissues and emits a radiation signal from inside. The signal is then detected by a machine like this with the rotating gantry to produce an image of the heart. This can be done while the patient is at rest or under exercise or pharmacologically induced stress to see if there are any changes in cardiac function or blood flow. When you exercise, your oxygen and energy demand increases. The heart responds to increased blood flow and speed up the delivery of nutrients to your tissues. If you have heart disease, exercise, the stress condition, can induce abnormal perfusion and metabolic patterns that can be detected by NM. SPECT measures blood flow and radioactive signal distribution in tissues to assess a variety of conditions related to blood flow, like coronary artery disease or CAD, in cardiac imaging applications. It generally uses a radioisotope like technetium-99 as the tracer. The tracer emits a photon for direct signal detection in this case. This is a cartoon representation of technetium-99, while this image at the bottom here shows what process SPECT data looks like. PET is used for targeted imaging of certain metabolic processes, blood flow measurements, regional chemical composition, and chemical absorption. Different tracers target different biological processes and medical conditions and can be used to diagnose or monitor treatment progression. PET tracers generate detectable signals indirectly by emitting positrons that annihilate with electrons and produce two photons that travel in opposite directions. These tracers are most commonly multi-atom molecules labeled with radioisotopes, as opposed to just a radioisotope on its own. So they're a little different from SPECT tracers in that way as well. This is the 3D chemical structure of a fluorine 18 labeled PET tracer called pyridaz. And at the bottom is an image showing how PET scans can be combined with CT for improved anatomical context. Depending on the type of molecule it is, a PET tracer can be produced using a cyclotron or a radionuclide generator. Cyclotrons are a type of particle accelerator, while generators are devices used to obtain short-lived radioisotopes from longer-lived parent isotopes. If the half-life of the tracer is very short, production must be performed on site, which limits the availability of this technology. For certain applications and use cases, PET has some advantages over SPECT. SPECT imaging generally involves visually or semi-quantitatively assessing relative perfusion defects, which can be prone to error. In obese or female patients, SPECT for myocardial perfusion imaging, or MPI, frequently exhibits attenuation artifacts. In these populations, PET can produce better quality images. Additionally, PET offers the opportunity to quantitatively measure myocardial blood flow, or MBF, and myocardial flow reserve, or MFR. MBF refers to the volume of blood delivered to the myocardium per unit time. MFR is a measure of evaluating the capacity of the coronary arteries to increase blood flow in response to increased demand from the myocardium. Most of these are useful measures in assessment of both of these are useful measures in assessment of cardiovascular disease, whether it's for diagnosis, risk stratification, prognosis, or therapeutic monitoring. Many of these advantages and indications are related to the way PET radiotracers are taken up by cardiac tissues in different states. So that segues into my main point. I'm not sure how many of you guys are bioengineering students at UCSD, but a big focus I've noticed the program has is understanding tissues on a cellular, biomechanical, and biochemical level. And we learned about that because it's really the foundation of engineering new treatments, devices, and diagnostic strategies like PET imaging. I think something that's really important to keep in mind is that even though a lot of what we talked about in this class involves electronically rendered data, the real-life setting of actual biological tissues is fundamental and crucial to understanding how these technologies work. And that's really the ultimate goal of my presentation today, to explain how and why the biochemical properties of cardiac tissues and radiotracers are intertwined, so that the math and physics-based material we learned in lectures is contextualized within cardiobiology. The first thing I'm going to do is go into a significant amount of background on cell and cardiobiology, because depending on your academic backgrounds, there could be a lot of fundamentals that need to be introduced before you can really understand the biochemical mechanisms of the tracers. Even if you've seen all of this before, it's still kind of a nice refresher, I think. The next thing I'm going to do is talk about the general localization mechanisms of PET tracers and the tissue states they target. This will lead me into a more detailed look at the biochemistry of 4 radiotracers I chose to profile. The first 2 will be similar in that they are simpler molecules, and the next 2 are more current developments. And then finally, I'll end with concluding thoughts on future directions. So going into the background here, the cell membrane is essential for maintaining homeostasis, or a balance of favorable conditions within the cell despite external changes. It's made of a phospholipid bilayer that has a mosaic of structural molecules and proteins like transporters and surface receptors. It's selectively permeable, which means it only allows the entry of certain things from the outside. But the cells can still interact with the external environment without permitting entry. For example, surface receptors actually allow the binding of molecules that can trigger intracellular signaling cascades. The properties of membrane components dictate which things are allowed to enter. So phospholipids are amphipathic molecules, so they have a hydrophilic or polar and lipophilic or nonpolar region. The outward-facing phospholipid heads are very polar, meaning that they like interacting with water and other polar molecules, while the internal tails are very nonpolar, meaning that they don't like water and prefer interacting with other nonpolar molecules. So because of the membrane's hydrophobic center, small nonpolar molecules can pass through the membrane directly, while larger or polar molecules generally need to enter through these transporter proteins. In contrast to the membrane, the cytoplasm is a hydrophilic environment. It contains different organelles, which are functional units that allow the cell to maintain homeostasis and carry out its specialized functions in the body. Even though all the native cells in your body share the same genome, different cell types actually have different gene expression patterns. So this is what enables the cells to express different numbers of cell surface receptors and transporters depending on their specialized functions. These expression patterns are also dynamic and can change with environmental stimuli. So a single cell type can have a variety of different expression patterns depending on the environmental conditions. And this is all fundamentally mediated by the membrane that acts as the cell's primary interface with the outside world. Surface receptors and transporters are not necessarily specific to one molecule. So many of these can actually recognize other molecules if those molecules have structural or chemical similarity to the native one. If we want to target specific receptors or transporters because they're somehow involved or correlated with the disease state we want to study, we can design analogs or similar molecules to the native ones and tag them with something that can produce some kind of detectable signal. And signal could be a number of things, but in the case of nuclear medicine and PET imaging, it's photons. In order for the signal to be useful for imaging a specific tissue state, it needs to get taken up by that tissue somehow. So molecules can enter the cell via passive or active transport. Passive transport does not require energy input because it's driven by concentration gradients. It involves a tracer entering a cell via simple or facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion refers to directly or freely passing through the membrane, while facilitated diffusion is passage through transporter proteins like ion channels in the direction of the concentration gradient. The tracer flows from high to low, continuing until the concentration inside and outside the cell is equalized. But if diffusion is mediated by a transport protein, saturation kinetics can oppose the driving force. Since the number of transporters on the cell surface is finite, there's a threshold concentration at which transporters are saturated. So any increase in tracer concentration will not increase the amount of tracer entering the cell per unit time, and the transport rate reaches its maximum here. This diagram down here is just a way to represent these differences in membrane transport qualitatively. Generally speaking, uptake by simple diffusion is linear, while facilitated diffusion can be nonlinear. And active transport is nonlinear as well. So it involves energy-driven passage of the tracer into the cell through transporters like pumps, symporters, or antiporters, often against the concentration gradient. And the limiting factor here is saturation kinetics. Uptake alone is not enough to permit localization of the target or of the tracer. So cellular localization of these tracers is actually mediated by the balance of intracellular uptake with metabolism and elimination. Tracer accumulation in the target tissue is only possible if the rate of uptake outweighs the elimination rate. While there are a number of ways that tracers can resist elimination from the cell, the most common method seems to actually be metabolic trapping. So a tracer can become metabolically trapped when it's altered inside the cell with the help of enzymes, which are proteins that speed up chemical reactions by making them more energetically favorable. But the main takeaway here is that the biochemical properties of PET tracers are essential to their utility as targeted imaging agents. So when designing these tracers, engineers need to be guided by the unique characteristics of the tissues and tissue states they want to target. And an ideal tracer would be one that has a high contrast between perfusion defects and normal perfusion, and between target background tissue, and between target and background tissue. So this means that it should be preferentially taken up or excluded from cardiac tissue in the tissue state, or in the target tissue, with low uptake or rapid washout from adjacent tissues. Since we're looking at PET tracers specifically for cardiac imaging, I want to go over some of the key metabolic characteristics of cardiac tissue and the various disease states that are clinically significant. So as cardiovascular disease progresses, the tissue can enter various states. It starts out as normally perfused, but inhibition of blood flow to the myocardium, usually due to an atherosclerotic blockage in the coronary arteries, leads to ischemia in certain regions of the heart. So prolonged ischemia can actually lead to tissue injury and death. And if an arterial plaque ruptures or the blockage reaches a critical size, a myocardial infarction can occur. And after the infarct, inflammation sets in at the injury site. Healthy myocardium constantly cycles through contractions, so it naturally has a high energy demand. Cardiomyocytes therefore need to exhibit certain properties to compensate for this. I'm sure everyone's heard the phrase mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. This is because their main job is to convert sugars and fats into an energy form cells can actually use, which is called ATP. Tissues with particularly high energy demand, namely myocardium, are enriched with mitochondria and therefore are also enriched with molecules that target mitochondrial proteins. In fact, 20 to 30% of myocardial intracellular volume is actually taken up by the mitochondria. And the proportion of certain molecules' contribution to energy production varies with the metabolic milieu, which is actually diet and oxygen dependent. Normal myocardium preferentially uses free fatty acids, or FFAs, over amino acids or glucose as a source of energy production. FFA metabolism requires oxygen, so it's called an aerobic process. When a blockage occurs, especially when the patient begins to exercise, decreased blood flow means hypoxic conditions. This triggers a distinct alteration of cardiomyocyte metabolism because using FFAs for energy requires oxygen. The cells begin expressing higher levels of the most efficient kinds of glucose transporters, and the myocardium begins to rely more on glucose for anaerobic glycolysis. Glycolysis is inefficient. It only produces 2 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose compared to 30 ATP per glucose through oxygen-dependent metabolism. The cardiomyocytes need to use up more glucose to compensate for the reduced energy output. This increases the flow of glucose into the cell. Additionally, under hypoxic conditions, there's a shift from little reliance on amino acids to notably increased levels of amino acid metabolism. If the ischemia lasts long enough, infarct or tissue death occurs because anaerobic metabolic processes cannot sustain the high energy demand for prolonged periods of time. After the infarct, there's an initial pro-inflammatory phase where certain inflammatory cells are recruited to the injury site. Many of these cells preferentially use glucose as their energy source, while some also promote inflammation by generating or secreting certain inflammatory agents. After the initial inflammation stage, one of two things can occur. The inflammation could begin to resolve, and then the inflammatory cells die off or leave, and while cells promoting healing migrate to the site, and stable scar tissue forms, which is mostly made of fibrous acellular proteins, or the balanced and coordinated immune response fails, and there could be an uncontrolled initial or resurgent inflammation and prolonged presence of immune cells. This actually indicates an elevated risk of long-term heart failure, which I'll talk about later. So how do PET tracers enable imaging of these various tissue states? To answer this question, I'm going to do a case-by-case analysis of the biochemical mechanisms of 4 different tracers. Rubidium-82 is a radioactive positively charged isotope of the element rubidium. Its primary indication is PET MPI, or myocardial or perfusion imaging, for non-invasive detection and evaluation of CAD. It has a short half-life of about 80 seconds. As of 2019, rubidium-82 is the most widely used PET tracer for assessment of CAD due to its higher diagnostic accuracy and additional prognostic potential compared to SPECT, especially for more challenging patient populations. Rubidium-82 is generally more accurate for perfusion defect assessment than SPECT tracers, but it still has issues with image quality due to its lower extraction fraction and short half-life. So this does affect its utility in absolute quantitation of MBF, but it's still very useful for detecting CAD. Give me 1 second, I'm going to take a sip of water. Okay, so rubidium-82 can be injected into the bloodstream as a saline solution, where it gets rapidly taken up by the myocardium and other highly vascularized tissues via active transport. Uptake is non-linearly proportional to the amount of blood perfusion. Regions of infarction or ischemia are then visualized as dark or photon deficient cold zones on the myocardial scan. Rubidium-82's mechanism of intracellular uptake and retention exploit the function of an active transporter called the sodium-potassium pump on the cell membrane. So the sodium-potassium pump favors intake rather than release of potassium ions. By coupling the intake of potassium ions into the cell with the release of sodium ions into the extracellular space against the concentration gradient, the pump actually is able to maintain a cardiomyocyte's resting membrane potential. And the membrane potential is a difference in the electric potential across the membrane that's vital for many cellular processes, including repolarization following contraction, which is something we talked about in class. So the pump is extremely important to cardiac electrophysiology. And I just included this annotated Wiggers diagram for context. I thought it was just interesting to see how that relates to the cardiac cycle. But so how does this work? So rubidium-82 is actually, it actually acts as a potassium analog, which means its chemical properties, namely its size and charge, are similar enough to native potassium ions that the sodium-potassium pump will recognize it as potassium and allow it to enter the cell. In normal tissue, the pump favors the intake of more rubidium cations, but its activity is impaired in ischemia and heart failure. So what we see is an increase in radioactive signals in the perfused and viable myocardium, where perfusion is normal and intracellular retention is favored, while the tracer either doesn't reach or is not well retained by ischemic tissue. Interestingly, despite the efficient mechanism of cell entry, I would like to note that rubidium-82 has a lower myocardial extraction fraction compared to other PET tracers, meaning that the myocardium extracts a smaller fraction of this tracer from the blood. So there's actually less contrast between the target tissue and the background, which can reduce image quality. Based on what I read, it seems like this could be a result of maximum transport rate and short half-life. So short-lived radio tracers like rubidium-82 are often injected at higher doses to obtain detectable signals, which suggests a possible influence of saturation kinetics. So basically, the high dose would flood the blood with rubidium, but the cardiomyocytes have a finite number of transporters and can only take in so much tracer per unit time, which would lead to an accumulation in the blood. By the time a larger portion of the tracer has been pulled into the cells, the signal might already be mostly gone. But there was frustratingly little information about this in the literature, so that's definitely just an educated guess. So N13 ammonia is a radio-labeled version of ammonia, wherein the central nitrogen atom is a radioactive nitrogen isotope. This is its chemical structure. Like rubidium-82, its primary indication is PET-MPI for CAD detection and diagnosis. Its half-life is a bit longer than rubidium-82 at about 10 minutes, but this is still short enough to mostly limit production to small on-site cyclotrons. The stable form of ammonia is a natural byproduct of cellular metabolism of amino acids and other nitrogen-containing compounds. It's a small, polar, uncharged molecule with a pyramid-like shape that regularly undergoes buffering reactions to form an ammonium ion. N13 ammonia acts as an ammonium analog and is taken up mainly by healthy myocardium. Once it enters the cell, it's temporarily trapped there when an enzyme helps convert it to N13 glutamine. The cellular localization of N13 glutamine enables PET imaging. Unfortunately, the actual mechanism of cellular uptake of N13 ammonia is not fully understood, although there are some hypotheses. A few of the sources I looked at suggest that it's some form of passive transport, either directly across the membrane or through an ion channel with facilitated diffusion. If this is the case, the driver of this influx would be lower concentration of ammonia in healthy cardiomyocytes, so the tracer would not diffuse as much into ischemic tissues because the cells in these regions will exhibit heightened amino acid metabolism and therefore a higher concentration of ammonia byproduct. Another hypothesis is that it's actively transported into the cell by the sodium-potassium pump due to its biophysical similarity to the potassium ion. In that case, it would have a more similar mechanism to rubidium-82. This tracer has a higher myocardial extraction fraction than rubidium, which means its perfusion defect contrast is also better. It might be that this is from enhanced uptake efficiency due to a combined transport mechanism through ion channels as ammonia and directly through the cell membrane as through ion channels as ammonium and directly through the cell membrane as uncharged ammonia, whereas the positively charged rubidium only has one primary route of entry. So rubidium-82 and N13 ammonia have been around for a bit, but recent advancements in PET tracers involve the use of fluorine-18 radio labels because they have much longer half-lives. This has advantages in terms of longer image acquisition times and production at regional rather than obligatory on-site cyclotrons. There are quite a few of these being explored, but there are two that really stand out. One's FDA approved with more indications being explored, while the other is still investigational. F18 fluorodeoxyglucose, or FDG, is an analog of glucose radio-labeled with fluorine-18. As of 2021, it's the most commonly used PET radio tracer for assessment of post-ischemic inflammation and myocardial viability. The extraction fraction is similar to that of rubidium-82. Native glucose is a small polar molecule that can enter the cell via facilitated diffusion or active transport through glucose transporters. Once it enters the cell, an enzyme converts glucose back to glucose 6-phosphate, a form that can't pass back out of the cell through facilitated diffusion, so it gets stuck inside. It can then be broken down as an energy source through cellular metabolism. This creates a concentration gradient where there is more intact glucose outside than inside, which drives a continued influx of it into the cell. So just a reminder, myocardial inflammation occurs following ischemic injury. Normal myocardium preferentially uses fatty acids as an energy source, whereas inflammatory cell types primarily use glucose in acute stages of inflammation. Both have high energy demands, but when inflammatory cells move into the injured area, the flux of glucose into the cells in this region is increased significantly. As a glucose analog, FDG takes advantage of this differential glucose uptake. Its proportional localization to tissues with altered glucose metabolism, mismatched with the perfusion deficit, enables visualization of inflamed areas that may still be viable. Conversely, dark regions where both perfusion and metabolic activity are lower indicates irreversible scarring. I should note, though, that there was some mention of using tissue viability detection as a guide for implementing revascularization, which is somewhat controversial. There were some nuclear sub-studies done with FDG that showed very similar results to the NM Courage trial we examined in homework 3. So essentially, the risk of cardiac events was about the same for optical medical therapy versus revascularization procedures. So FDG PET alone shouldn't be used as the sole decision maker for revascularization. Additionally, FDG has some other uses as a prognostic or risk indicator. The higher amount of inflammation it detects, the greater the risk of dysregulation and the more negative the long-term prognosis for heart function. FDG enables imaging of this because the metabolic profile at the injury site switches from glucose-preferring inflammatory to fatty acid-preferring cell types when healing is progressing normally, but it stays the same more or less with prolonged acute inflammation. Interestingly, FDG can also be used to image plaques in vessels like the carotid artery using a similar visualization mechanism to the myocardium. An association has been observed between vascular FDG uptake and diabetes and metabolic syndrome, which are known cardiovascular risk factors. But because any metabolically active tissue that preferentially uses glucose as an energy supply can uptake FDG, there are some issues with specificity. F18 flurpiridaz is an investigational PET MPI tracer. I mentioned previously that rubidium-82 has limited utility for absolute quantitation of MBF because of its lower extraction fraction and short half-life. Flurpiridaz has a much longer half-life and an excellent myocardial extraction fraction, which makes it ideal for this application. Its high perfusion defect contrast means that it has the potential to be highly sensitive for obstructive CAD detection, especially in challenging patient populations. In terms of its biochemistry, flurpiridaz is a structural analog of an insecticide called pyridibin. Pyridibin is a nonpolar small molecule that has limited toxicity to humans in small doses. There was very little information or even mention of its intracellular uptake mechanism beyond the fact that it's mostly unknown, but it's likely free passive diffusion due to its structural and chemical properties and its similarity to other molecules that do the same. Once inside the cell, pyridibin gets into the lipophilic mitochondrial membrane where it binds to the mitochondrial protein complex 1. MC1 is very important to metabolic pathways within the mitochondria. As a pyridibin analog, flurpiridaz exploits cardiac tissue's unique level of mitochondrial enrichment to preferentially target the myocardium. Its uptake in the myocardium is considered linearly proportional to MBF. Cardiomyocytes demonstrate rapid uptake and slow elimination of flurpiridaz, meaning that the tracer has high accumulation capabilities in target tissue. Assuming that it does indeed use simple diffusion to enter the cell, the driving force would be the concentration gradient, and the entrapment mechanism might be related to its binding to MC1. Flurpiridaz has shown promise in phase 3 clinical trials and may be the next FDA-approved radiotracer on the market for quantitative PET MPI. So this is a fascinating development that I think represents the direction of the field pretty well. So moving ahead with the direction of the field, I want to add some final thoughts. Besides flurpiridaz, there are quite a few novel PET tracers on the horizon, the vast majority of them being fluorine-18 compounds. Some of these seek to address the specificity issues seen with FDG by exploiting more specific markers of myocardial inflammation and related cellular processes, including binding to surface receptors known to be expressed under certain conditions. There's also a potential opportunity for FDG to be used for direct assessment of myocardial ischemia, because of its localization mechanism. But despite these exciting new advancements, there's one thing that won't change: the fundamental importance of the underlying biochemistry. So I'd like to thank Dr. McVeigh for his guidance on project ideas and directions. Your input really helped me to complete a project I'm passionate about, so thank you. And also thanks to all of you for being such a great audience and listening to me for the past half hour. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Are there any questions?
All right, thank you.
I just wanted to add a comment. Thank you for all that background. You're absolutely right. When it comes to biochemistry, like sometimes the amount I don't know is just overwhelming, and so I can kind of just glaze past it. But I think like that is really helpful, and nuclear medicine is a great way to sort of introduce imaging people to that. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, and I appreciate. Thank you for appreciating that.
Yeah, no problem.
No, I'll second that. That was a tour de force. And I wish I had the skill and wherewithal to give that lecture during the course, because it's a very important part, obviously, of PET, is where agents are going in terms of, you know, being sensitive to the underlying biochemistry and the underlying tissue state. And what's really interesting about all those the older and the novel markers that you've highlighted there is the uncertainty as to actually, you know, there's hypotheses, I guess, about how they're being taken up and retained. But it's interesting to me that there's still a lot of uncertainty about that, right? And one question, I mean, for all of these agents, the primary distinction when you use them as a myocardial blood flow agent is, does the agent get there in the first place, right? So there is this big factor of just you know, the hydrodynamics, just the mechanics of getting this stuff to the tissue. And then there's this second order effect, especially with these fantastic PET agents, of what is it marking in the cell and why is it retained in that cell? And that's where it gets really complicated, right? And
Yeah.
And whether or not these second order enhancements, when you look at the image, give you something that you can act upon in terms of treatment. That's the other very interesting question that comes up with, and you mentioned it, Danielle, like with courage and with the ischemia trial and all that. If we get more and more sophisticated markers, does it affect what we can do, right? Does it affect what you are going to prescribe for that patient to try and extend their life, right? And so it's a very interesting question, I think. These slides were fantastic. And again, I'm going to ask everybody to send me their slides. And yours looked like they had good citations in the boxes with the pictures and stuff like that. I would also ask that if next year when I give the course, if I can use some of these slides to introduce some folks to, you know, how PET is actually working on a biochemical level. That would be terrific if you would let me do that. Oh
yeah, absolutely. And I think I have a full list of references, but for your convenience, I can also put a full reference on the actual slide, if that would help.
Yeah, just cut and paste. You know, it doesn't have to be in a great form or anything, just so that I know where it came from and to look up some additional info on it and stuff like that. When you looked at the papers with these very advanced contrast agents or radionuclides, did they talk at all about expense? You know, what their relative cost is for doing, say, a PET with this new, what was it, fluoridipaz, I think?
Yeah, fluoridipaz, yeah. See, I think I would imagine that a lot of the people that are writing about these things seem to be like very passionate about using nuclear medicine. So I'd imagine that maybe they have like less emphasis on the actual cost of doing these things, because it was something that I did notice was not mentioned very often in these papers. Yeah, so, but I do remember you mentioning in lecture that these procedures can be very expensive, like mostly related to the fact that it requires very skilled personnel to do it, and like to manufacture the radio tracers and all that stuff. And, you know, the cyclotron itself is an expensive piece of equipment. So, yeah.
But it does have an ancillary, I mean, there's primary uses of PET in cancer, you know, so any advanced cancer center has PET scanners, right? And so it's well within, it's all reachable, right, for modern, you know, first world medicine. And in fact, there is, if you, right outside my lab, we're in ACTRI, which is this research building right next to the hospital. And so the hospital has outside it trailers that have scanners in the trailers, right? So they couldn't afford to like reconstruct a room to put a new scanner in. So they just, literally the company drives up this big old trailer and parks it. And inside one of those trailers is a PET CT scanner, right? So in that way, it can be, you know, quite available for all. Given the fact that the half-life of these F-18 tracers is much longer, I think that opens up a whole other set of applications, right? So
yeah, so I think the thing I was looking at is that for those ones, because of the longer half-life, they can actually be produced at regional cyclotrons. So that does open up availability for those. So that's like a major advantage for these.
yeah. So when it's regional, so that means like it's a few miles away and you get an Uber and drive the stuff over. Is that how that works? I don't know how that works.
I think a few miles away is for the, I think the N13 like ammonia one, because that one has like 10-minute half-life, but I'm not actually sure just how far away it could be. I mean, I'd imagine it would need to be sometime within like at least like an hour because of the like, you know, but I didn't actually run into that in the literature search. So
but 110 minutes, was that the half-life? The F-18 was 110? Is that what it said?
About, yeah.
That's great. It's a long time, right? I mean, that, you know, versus 90 seconds or whatever it was for rubidium. So rubidium, you got to like inject it in an image right away, and you run out of imaging time, right? Let alone, you know, transporting the contrast and everything. So, yeah, this is a really interesting field, and I'm sure it'll continue to develop, you know, pretty aggressive way. Fantastic. Any other questions for Daniela on that stuff? That was like completely new and orthogonal information from what we took in class, which is terrific. So I learned a bunch of stuff. All right, let's move on. We're nicely ahead of schedule here.
I will stop screen sharing, and also just thank you again for your comments, and yeah, good luck to the next person.
Yeah, thanks. This is very good. This is my favorite part of the course, actually. I like everybody's giving their stuff. Okay, so where are we now? We're at 9:30. Oh, so it's Noah and Shannon. Remodeling after pulmonary vein isolation for the left atrium. Excellent. All right.
All right. So good morning, everybody. My name is Shannon, and I'm here with my partner, Noah, to present left atrial remodeling after pulmonary vein isolation. So first, we're just going to touch on a little bit of background. So to start, Pulmonary vein isolation procedures are a means of treating left atrial fibrillation. We know that atrial fibrillation is a rapid, irregular heart rhythm that causes poor blood flow throughout the body and is caused by atrial malfunction. A common procedure to treat this is the PVI, where an ablation catheter is inserted into the left atrium to essentially burn the tissue surrounding the pulmonary veins. So this creates a blockage where these irregular electrical signals can't reach the veins as they normally would to come back into the atrium and allow recurrence of AFib. However, AFib recurrence post-op is still pretty high at approximately 21 to 40% or more. So next, fibrosis is a condition which plays a role in various arrhythmias such as AFib. Fibrosis is a part of the wound healing process, and it occurs as a means to repair damage to whichever organ has been injured. However, when fibrosis is prolonged, this can lead to the disorganization of cells and ECM components due to the excess deposition of collagen and fibronectin. As you can see on the top image, this can lead to abnormally spaced cardiomyocytes and disorganized collagen in the heart. We also know that excess of collagen will cause the heart walls to stiffen, which is a less than ideal outcome for an organ that needs to be able to expand and contract. So this stiffness, along with potentially limited intercellular electrical signaling, can result in AFib and AFib recurrence. So it has also been shown that there is a relationship between the recurrence of AFib and fibrotic myocardium, being 71.4% or higher in patients with greater than or equal to 30% of their left atrium fibrosed.
Great. So in addition to atrial fibrosis, another pattern or theme with atrial recurrence is correlations with the atrial size, both before and after the surgery. So the left atrium actually changes shape in response to the surgery. Over about 3 months after the surgery, the wall heals in some ways, and the underlying pathways are somewhat unknown. But then the atrium ends up reshaping. And because we don't know really the underlying pathways, we can't predict what that structural remodeling looks like. But we know that shape is important to measure the success of the surgery, because pre-surgery shape has been shown to be a good predictor of AFib recurrence. And so a question you might ask is, well, why not use the post shape as well to predict recurrence? And one answer to that is that after the surgery's been done, it's been done, and there's not so much utility to knowing exactly predicting recurrence using the post shape. But the change in shape could be used as a measure of success of the surgery, as there's been in particular one study that saw that lower ejection fraction post-surgery correlated with higher recurrence, and that's this graph here, where as you follow the survival rate 4 years after the procedure, patients who had reduced ejection fraction, way tanked below their counterparts. And what's interesting is that this isn't just having low ejection fraction, because if the patients had low ejection fraction before and after the surgery, then they were in this blue group. It's only with a large reduction in ejection fraction after the surgery that they joined this red group. So that, I think, was a really interesting result. And so that summarizes the problem. Now, the key aim of this project was to develop tools and markers that would predict AFib recurrence and help measure success. So we divided this into 2 parts. The first part that looks at fibrosis. So the goal was to develop a tool that automatically segments and quantifies regions of fibrosis using late gadolinium enhanced MRI. And then the other aim was to use statistical shape modeling to describe the remodeling that happens after the procedure, and sort of characterize, like, using the pre-surgery shape as a starter, the end surgery shape as a marker, and then calculating displacements as well. And we used data from the C-dermis fibrosis scar challenge, which was done in 2012. It's 30 patients with left atrium images before and after surgery at, atrial diastole, so when the atrium's at its largest point. And it comes with clinician created segmentations as well. And I've linked this challenge for you here. So I'll hand it over to Shannon for aim 1. And throughout this, this can definitely be, well, I should mention, this challenge does not have the patient outcomes. And so that limits us a little bit how much we can talk about results. And so when we get to that portion of the talk, that can definitely be a much more conversational thing about what our results could mean, in the absence of having the actual patient outcomes.
Yes. So the first aim is quantifying fibrosis. So first, we're just going to outline kind of what we had done for the midterm presentation of this is what the method that we're using to quantify fibrosis. So the first thing we did that is we took the delayed enhancement MRI images and it was of slices of the atria and they were cropped. Then one would go through and manually select for what they believe the atrial wall bounds to be. After this, a semi-automated algorithm would be used to assign a threshold intensity to that image, and this would correlate the enhanced or fibrotic voxels of the left atrium through the mean and standard deviation calculations. And this is where we use the pixel intensity histogram that is shown on the right. And then next, a threshold cutoff would be manually chosen depending on the mean and standard deviations, and adjustments can be made accordingly. So at the very end of this, you'll see an image on the bottom left where you would essentially yield a picture of that left atrium and the yellow would highlight the fibrotic tissue. So this is where we actually applied the method. So the first image on the left is going to show the cropped left atrium and then the segmentation of that atrium. And then when we go to the right side, we have the image multiplied by the segmentation here on the left, which I said was the MIS, because then we took that and expanded it by 10 pixels. Now, 10 pixels might seem like a little, like kind of lot because the paper that we looked at only expanded by 3 to 4, but we, as you can see at the very top of the expansion, there's a bit of really some bright pixels, and we wanted to incorporate that entire section into our highlighting, essentially. So next slide. And then we went through and we subtracted. So we took that expansion and we subtracted the MIS, and this is what we believe the left atrium wall to be. And so with that, we took this data of these different pixel intensities and we put them into a histogram. And so this is where we were able to look at means and standard deviations and choose what we believe the threshold to be. And I chose 258, which is a little bit over 2 standard deviations above the mean. It's depicted by that red arrow. And then lastly, I went through and made a binary mask to be able to highlight in yellow the scar tissue. Now, we got the code to work where you can, change the threshold as you'd like. You can change the expansion pixel amount. But Dr. McVeigh, as you had said to us during the midterm, we definitely learned how difficult it is to actually, have confidence that we selected the right boundaries for the left atrial wall, and just that we're selecting the correct thresholds to even be able to, highlight the correct scar tissue, because as you can see on like the bottom right of the highlighted scar tissue graph, there's a bit of like some bright looking pixels there, but they weren't highlighted by the threshold I chose. And so it's kind of, there's a lot of ambiguity still with this method of like, how accurate were we? So that was definitely a challenge. But
yeah, I've watched this happen over the years, and it is a huge challenge. I mean, if you look up also at the top, say at 12 o'clock in your image, you have this really dark stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so you're going to have a lot of tissue or signal variability. And you're going to, and you have it down there. And then the question is, well, if that can go really dark, then can normal tissue, this stuff at 4 o'clock, which, obviously you're a little stressed that you left that behind, right? You think, well, that's probably, scar tissue. But it's just, you're doing the best you can. This is what people do, I think, as they go through these. They just like make the call, based on their own gut instinct and the picture. The issue is the images are taken in people that are really hard to image with MRI. You know,
Yeah.
they have arrhythmias, they're breathing, you know, you need a lot of this. So it's really tough stuff. But I agree with your cutoff. That looks good to me.
Thank you. Yeah, it was definitely a difficult process, but it does look nice to see a result. But yeah, still, that's definitely very ambiguous. So
Another interesting point, I think, is that if we had the patient outcomes, this study correlated, or not this study, but other studies have correlated fibrotic volume with patient results. So we know there's some kind of correlation there. And if we had those, then we might be able to use that like benchmark to tune that, like optimize the threshold. And maybe that's a non-arbitrary way to pick a value.
Right. Well, you'd have to have enough such that you could train on one set and then test on another where you
Right.
don't have any training data, right? But it's yeah, that's true.
Okay, so we'll move into aim 2, which is shape-based statistics. So we'll start with some pre-processing steps. So all of the images, we got 30 patients with pre and post operation data, and they came with clinician, expert segmentations. And the quality of these was highly variable. They came from different centers, lots of different clinicians with different amounts of time, vastly different image qualities. And so this is actually one of the better ones that I picked out, but on the left here is the expert done. And then this is the one that we touched up. So key things that we did, we made sure that they were in standard orientations. For the shape modeling to work in the next step, they all have to be in the same orientation. So we had to flip just a handful. Most of them were pretty good. And then we wanted to draw the segmentations to the interior of the atrial wall. So you can see this one kind of overdrew it. So we pulled it back here, same down here, and then we filled in the wall in some locations as well. So just some minor touch-ups there. Then we pull it into a software called ShapeWorks, which is a shape modeling software, and it turns the binary segmentation masks into surfaces with some Gaussian smoothing that you can control for. And then we define the shapes by applying landmarks. So we applied 2 landmarks here. Something that all the atrium have is a tip of the appendage, and then the mitral valve plane. And then we groomed away the pulmonary arteries, just because that was an obvious human source of human variability, where some clinicians drew in a lot of the pulmonary arteries and some barely did at all. So just to get rid of that human error, we just chopped them off completely. And then ShapeWorks uses Procrustes particle optimization to basically spread more landmarks out over the surface. And we did this with all of the patients, all the images at once, so that each point you see here on the atrium has corresponding points for every other patient. So it's a true landmark and not just a point cloud. They're all related to each other, the patients. Okay, so now that we have these shape models with these points representing the shapes, so this is all done in ShapeWorks. We can do some statistics with the shapes. So right here on the right is the pre-surgery mean shape, very I guess what you'd expect out of an atrium. Although I suspect that the clinician segmentations weren't really doing much to get the left atrial appendage.
So when you say mean, this is the mean over this whole group of patients?
Yes, yeah, the mean over the 30 patients before surgery.
Got it. Does that make sense with something like a left atrium though?
You mean taking a mean?
Without scaling, and I'm assuming to take this mean, just have your raw data, and it's in millimeters or something, right? It's the actual in.
Yeah.
And then if I was to average this person's left atrium with this person, if this person's 6'8" and this person's 5'2", they'll have different size atria, right? So it
Mhm.
was some kind of scaling done before this averaging was done?
I don't believe, unless the software, no scaling was done with the patient data, unless the software does like some normalization with
Right.
volume or something.
Right.
I don't believe so.
Okay. Yeah,
but-
because I think some atria are just like totally different, they,
Yeah.
they're almost flat and stuff like that. So I think, but anyway, I'll just let you keep going.
Yeah, and so on the left here, these are the individual patients. So you can see how much they deviate from the mean by the color scheme. So, patient 3, for
Okay.
example,
I got it.
This person has a much larger atrium, and that could be either because of, the size of the patient, or left atrial swelling often occurs, with AFib.
Right. Right.
But I hope that we'll address that concern also in the displacement modes.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm getting the idea that it's more, the stuff that's more interesting is the stuff on the left, really. It's just like, how am I bigger than the rest? Am I smaller than the rest? I see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So here's a pre-surgery shape, and this is the most studied area of atrial shape models. The group out of Utah that made ShapeWorks has done this kind of study.
Yeah.
With the left atria. What has not really been done is studies on post-surgery shape.
Okay.
So I'll flip back and forth. If you look at the post-surgery mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's like not much change at all,
Right.
really.
Right.
That's why we ended up doing a displacement mode, because when you take the, when you make shape models using before and after, and you just sort of like aggregate all of the patients into one thing, some of the patient variability is lost.
Right.
Because, looking back at patient 3, I'll flip back and forth between the slides. Like that's a really drastic change.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some, like this one, like patient 4, or patient 8, this is a much less drastic change.
Yeah.
A much less response to the surgery.
Let me ask a quick question about the ones on the left. Did post-surgery, did they all get smaller, or did they mostly, or did most of them get bigger, or?
That is a good question.
Or is it sort of, I guess if the means are identical, then it must be somewhere in the, some got smaller, some got bigger, probably.
Yeah, I would say it's probably they get on average, they get bigger in some locations and smaller in others.
Oh, yeah.
So I think, I don't remember exactly what slide that's on, but I think we'll get to that as well.
Okay. All right. It's complex data, right? It's hard to.
And that's why I wanted this to be kind of conversational too, because basically, what ShapeWorks is doing is it's using principal component analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a technique that separates the ways that the shape models can vary into completely orthogonal independent modes. So with this model, there are 384 degrees of freedom because we placed 128 landmarks, and each of them has 3 coordinate points. So there are a lot of ways that the models can vary. Mm-hmm. But when you run PCA, you find that 90% of the variance is explained by just 10 shape modes. So we'll demonstrate some of these modes here. So this is mode 1 of pre-surgery. And it starts with the average shape, and then you can expand. As it expands and contracts, it's moving like different standard deviations up and down the mode.
Okay, so mode 0 is basically just volume, like whole.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Mode 0 definitely tends to just be size.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and if you want to dive into this, if we have some time left, we can, open ShapeWorks and cycle through some of the modes.
Okay.
If you're curious in that.
What's the difference between the left and the right here? I'm sorry.
Left is pre-surgery.
Oh, pre and post. And this is, along standard deviations. And so, okay, got it. All right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is just demonstrating that every patient can receive a shape score from every mode, depending on how far they deviate or how many standard deviations away they are in a certain mode. So this is all of our patients.
Mhm.
And so ShapeWorks outputs a lambda, which I'm not exactly sure what that, I think that might be like the eigenvalue without any modification or something. No, it's not the eigenvalue. It's not a standard deviation, but it's similar. It's how much that each mode is deviating from the average.
Yeah.
So this is just showing the first 3 modes, but you can see that every patient has their own unique profile before and after surgery.
Yeah. And some, so like the polarity of the blue one of mode 0 flips. So I guess it gets smaller or bigger depending on mode 0, right?
Mhm.
And pre-surgery, yeah, okay. One. And does mode 1 or 2 have any simple explanation what they are? Like, are they ellipsoidal, stretch in a particular direction or something?
Let's look at that real quick. So here's mode 1.
This is just cycling through the standard deviations, sort of.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's almost like an oblique kind of stretch.
Yeah, yeah.
And that here's mode 3. I think this is what they would call like sphericity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I see what you're saying. It's sort of getting rounder versus bit of getting flat.
Yep. Yeah, and this is what sphericity is one of the key predictors that's been found in literature to be predictive of AFib recurrence.
Right. Right.
So I actually haven't looked at this one yet. This is really nice.
Yeah, cool.
Okay. We'll keep going for time.
Yeah, what are we at? We're at yeah, you got 8 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So in the last part of this aim, we noticed that we are losing some patient to patient information, just doing pre and post. So we wanted to look at displacement. So we have the pre and post shapes here. So we calculated displacement vectors from those, and then we ran PCA on the displacement vectors themselves. And so what this is telling you is how did the patient respond to the surgery? And then we can score patients in a similar fashion. So ShapeWorks is not equipped for this, so we built our own custom scripts in Python. There's still the same amount of degrees of freedom because you still have 3 components for the displacement vectors. And still 88% of the variance was captured by 10 shape modes.
Okay.
And so here's that around. Here is the mean displacement mapped on to the mean pre-op shape. So if we're completely random, I guess you'd see one uniform color. But what's interesting is you see a lot of deformation happening in the posterior wall and a red spot also in the lateral wall.
Right.
So the surgery has a pattern of there's a pattern of remodeling that happens in response to the surgery. It's not just random, which makes sense because the surgery itself is not random.
Right.
So next we'll get into the actual shape modes. So these are open questions, is that do these modes mean anything? And one thing I want to emphasize, because I found myself getting confused, is that these are not like, these don't show how the atrium's deforming over a cardiac cycle. It's showing like what are the different ways that the surgery can change the atrium. So mode 1, it's spinning and changing at the same time. So mode 1, I think, is it's growing and getting wider.
Yeah.
So it's not pure growth.
It almost looks like it's growth mostly in that in the direction that's up and down on the screen, right?
Mhm.
Goes the other way. Okay.
And then this mode I think is pure growth. I think it stays basically the same shape, basically the same width.
Yeah.
But as you go up the standard deviations, it shrinks. So I guess this would tell you, because it started large and went smaller, I guess this would tell you that, in general, maybe the surgery is making the atria smaller.
It could. I mean, ideally, if you get an atrium to start contracting normally once again, it could shrink down, right? As opposed to when it's just a bag undergoing pressure.
Yeah.
So that's totally viable. They get smaller. In fact, you would hope that if your atrium was expanding with this disease, you would, when you fix it, it would come back to a sort of a normal size.
Right. And then last mode that I'll show. We have these for the first 6 modes, I believe.
Yeah.
So this is the sphericity mode, I think. So it ends up getting what starts, more oblong and then gets more circular.
Yeah, the points come in.
Mhm.
And so this each one of these modes, like that thing that's sort of sticks out as a point, that's towards the left atrial appendage. Is that right?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
It actually might be useful when you're doing these things to at least keep where the pulmonary veins are marked in some way, right? And so that if you know where they are, then you know where all of the different features are, like the roof and the posterior wall and the anterior wall and all that.
Mhm.
So even if they were just circles or just bumps or something, it would be good to have them there, I think.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Right.
Okay, and then just like before, every patient receives a displacement score. So we have the first 7 modes, which is like 75% of the variance. And from this, we can pick out outliers, which is really interesting. So patient, this is actually patient 2. I looked into this one. It was a huge outlier on mode 1, which means the surgery had a very large effect on basically the size of it. So we don't have patient outcomes, but I would actually predict that the outlier might do really well here. Because if the shape changed drastically, that means you had a very strong reaction to the surgery.
Right.
And hopefully that's the right reaction.
Yeah, as long as if it changed drastically by getting really big, then you got a problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but the fact that there are outliers here makes me optimistic about whether these can be predictive of surgical success.
And the data from which these were taken, is it CT data or MR?
MR.
It's all MR. Okay.
All MR. Yep.
And were they cine MR or just single?
Nope, just single shot MR.
Okay.
So in our last slide here, we wanted to show an example of a clinical workup that a patient might get. Patient 1 comes in for atrial fibrillation, gets pre-screened. We measured the fibrosis score. In this particular patient, there was a 1.5% fibrosis in the atrial wall based on the threshold that we chose. And an increase of 0.9% if we change the threshold a bit more. As Shannon was saying, there's an important choice to be made in the threshold.
So as a comment on that, so going from the 258 threshold is the original threshold I had chosen. That showed the data that I was talking about earlier. And then I lowered it by 1/4 of a standard deviation, and the increase in percentage was that high. So and this is just in like one 2D slice of the atrium. And so if we were to kind of apply this to the entire atrium, that percentage could really add up. And that just kind of further shows the ambiguity, like with choosing these thresholds, and did we get the right boundaries and like being able to quantify this fibrosis, because as said in the background, it was talking about how like fibrosed atrium of like 30% or greater has a pretty high recurrence of AFib. And so these are some pretty big differences when you scale that to 3D, the whole 3D atrium. But yeah.
Yeah, and so as a final comment, so we have the fibrosis scores, the shape scores, the displacement scores. And the great thing is because of the PCA and the unique method of doing fibrosis counting, all these scores should theoretically be independent.
Yeah.
So the idea is that when you have the patient outcomes, you can combine all of these into a predictive model of AFib recurrence. Or in the case of measuring the post shape and displacement, you might find a marker of success that or failure that predates AFib recurrence. So you imagine that after the surgery, the success of the surgery is basically just marked let's wait and see if you get AFib again.
Yeah.
So maybe you could get more of an insight, besides just waiting for that to happen.
Right. And then other, data that could be important in all this is how does this relate to what they find when they first start mapping to do the ablation? They'll poke around and make some electrical maps.
Mm-hmm.
And so depending on how crazy or those maps are, perhaps that also feeds into this as well, right? So that's all right. That's cool.
Yep, so that concludes.
Great. I'm sorry I dominated the questions through the talk. Any questions from the class on that one? I'm very interested in the atria these days, so it was good stuff. Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone.
That was terrific. Let me see where we're going next. We're at 10. So Ryan and Brandon, we're going to do speckle tracking. Oh, this will be fun. Okay, and is this our last talk? I think it is, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. All right, let me screen share it. Can everybody see this? I think it's working.
So
okay,
far,
cool.
Yeah, it looks good.
All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Brandon. I'm with Ryan, and we're going to be talking about speckle tracking, specifically how it is used to calculate strain in echocardiography data. So just to give a little overview of what we're going to talk about, we're going to start out with some background about myocardial strain, which is what we're trying to measure, and then what speckle tracking and speckle actually are. And then we are going to talk about briefly the goals that we had, and then how we implemented our approach, including like kind of the math behind it, and then the like everything that we actually implemented. And then we're going to talk about the results that we got and some conclusions, and then we're going to go and actually we're going to try to do a live demo of the code, because I think that it's a little bit hard to capture fully what we did in images. So so yeah, that's where we'll end on. So I'll give it to Ryan to put some background.
Yeah, so myocardial strain is a measurement of tissue deformation. And most of the time we are calculating myocardial strain on the left ventricle, as this tends to be what is used for diagnosis, and has a wide range of diagnoses that it can be used for. However, the real benefit of using echo to calculate this type of information is just how cheap echo is and how accessible it is compared to the other imaging modalities.
You actually have to be careful there because it's not that cheap. It turns out that when you look at how people are billed, echo isn't that cheap. Like to go in and you have an echo tech and then somebody reads it and stuff like that. They get reimbursed pretty comfortably for echo. CT, on the other hand, is ridiculously cheap. Like CT, you get reimbursed like $189 or something like that. So
I think the bigger advantage is usually that it's portable, right? Like you can kind of, if somebody's confined to a hospital bed, you can just kind of go up to them and bring it to them, right? I think that's one of the advantages is that, like the portability.
it's fantastic. Yeah. So if they're in the ER or whatever, you just roll the thing up to the side of the bed and you can see how they're doing, you know, right there.
And it's harmless.
Yeah,
Completely.
I guess, unless you get the wrong call. Right.
Yeah, so to measure myocardial strain, we're using this technique called speckle tracking. Speckle is basically this noise-like pattern that we see inside of tissue in ultrasound images. And this comes from sort of interference patterns generated within the tissue by like some of the microstructures that cause all of these backscattering waves. So in the top, we have these two images of sort of just like this idea modeled from like perfect wave points. Yeah, so the great thing about speckle is that because it's coming from the tissue itself, it is generally consistent as the heart is moving around, which is why we are able to track it. And we're able to check like how reliable that is, and we'll go into that a little bit later. But with speckle tracking, we create these motion fields. As you can see in the bottom right image. Yeah, good. So for the calculation of strain, we're going to be calculating it on, so we calculated it on 3 different images, the 4-chamber, 2-chamber, and long axis view, trying to target all the different regions to sort of match up to the classic bullseye plot. So this is just a refresher from the course.
Okay, so our project goals were to implement a few different speckle tracking methods because we wanted to compare how they work, and just to see if we could make improvements or which ones are like certain things. As you'll see, we added like certain features that made it, we think, better. So we wanted to test that out, and then we also wanted to use this speckle tracking to make a tool that we could use to calculate like the strain measurements, like specifically regional strain, and with global longitudinal strain, which can be like just calculated from those regional strain measurements for a particular patient. One thing that we talked about in our like kind of midterm one that we wound up not using is we thought that there was a wavelet transform method that could be used. It turns out that the method that I was reading about was actually for, and this is just like kind of an aside, not related. It was actually like a CT speckle thing where they were kind of creating speckle patterns at different thicknesses or at different like depths. And that's what they were doing. So it was similar, but definitely not applicable to what we were doing. But I just thought that was kind of interesting that you can actually use some of these concepts in other modalities as well, where it's not necessarily natural that you get the speckle pattern. I don't know if you've ever worked with that since you're the CT.
No, I haven't seen speckle in CT, but in MR you can certainly put patterns in. You can like throw down tags and things like that, and so you could track, you know, various features. But the interesting, I agree. The great thing about echo is when you look at the movies, you see these points and they're moving with the heart. There's no question that they're moving with the heart. So whatever is making that interference is displacing with the heart. So, and they, you know, it's a big part of echo is when you just watch the movie is appreciating that, you know, tracking.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about our methods. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is like kind of the basic fundamental method. Like there's actually like a kind of a graphic thing that might be missing here. So in these two frames, we have kind of like a heat map of the image. I don't remember, is this the Fourier transform, right? Or is this the original image? Because I think it could be either.
This is the original image. So this is just the example of windows from two different frames.
Okay, yeah. So so the main feature for speckle tracking would be the normalized cross correlation method. So the idea behind this is that if you take the correlation of two images, which is basically like convolution, but you're not flipping it. If you run them across each other, when they're the most similar, there will be a peak. So if you multiply them, and shift them across, you'll get a peak where they're the most similar. And so wherever that peak is will be where your kind of object of interest has moved to, right? So if you have some kind of motion, you can figure out where it is based on sort of that new peak when you do the cross correlation. And so what we'll talk about now is that you can actually do this in the Fourier transform domain, in the Fourier domain, which I think is on the next. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize it's an animation. So yeah, so when you run this across, you'll get a peak here and be able to detect that the object has moved there. But you can actually calculate this in the Fourier domain. So the convolution in the time domain or in the spatial domain would be like if you convolve in the spatial domain, it's equivalent to multiplying the Fourier transforms. And then the other what's it called? Property of Fourier transforms that we're taking advantage of here is that if you want to do the invert the spatial domain, so if you want to flip like the spatial axis, like flip the x-axis or flip the y-axis, that's equivalent to taking the complex conjugate of the Fourier transform. And so that's what this operation is here. And so you can actually calculate the correlation in the Fourier domain by multiplying the Fourier transforms where one of them is complex conjugated. Again, if it was convolution, it would just be a normal product. And then the normalized part of it is that we're dividing by the magnitude of that product. And so what happens is that if you do that multiplication in the Fourier domain and then take the inverse Fourier transform to get back into the spatial domain, you get that peak. Unfortunately, we don't have an image of it, but you do get a peak at the location where your object is moved to. And so you can figure out what that displacement is based on where that peak is. And then something else that we have to do. So if you were to just do this for the full image, right? If you were just to do it for the full image one time, you have a lot of things that are moving, right? So you have a bunch of different like patches of speckle that you're trying to keep track of. And so we need to do some kind of breaking the image down into sub windows. So that's what we did. And so we had two different methods for how we were doing this. So one method we were calling static, which is where for every frame, we were keeping the same window. And so this is like kind of the most straightforward way, I think, to do it. And then our other alternative would be that if your like little patch of speckle moves, we were following that with the window, just so you keep it kind of in frame. Because what happens is if you have a window that's kind of on the border of the tissue, what'll happen when that tissue moves is that your window is no longer covering anything important. And so it makes more sense to move it with each frame. So when we're doing just the basic normalized cross correlation method, we were prioritizing that dynamic method. I don't think the static method even gave us like reasonable results on just like a square image. On these ones, it was pretty bad. Because if it winds up that it's like on the border or something and it moves out of frame, it winds up being pretty bad. And so there's some issues with it. Yeah, I think that covers everything on sub windows. And then Ryan will talk about the following slides.
Yeah, so while the cross correlation method works surprisingly well and is surprisingly simple, the largest downfall of the method is that you can only get accuracy up to a single pixel and not between pixels. And there are a couple of methods that we saw for how to do this. Some of them like fitting a parabola or something like that. But the method that we decided to go with is called the Lucas-Conde method. Basically, it uses the least squares criterion to sort of calculate exactly how much movement there was in between pixels. And this comes from a field of optical flow estimation. So not necessarily designed for this specific use, but because we can calculate first using the cross correlation to get within the accuracy of a pixel, and then apply this method to just calculate the distance from where that like pixel value is to our actual like subpixel location. This method works extremely well and is surprisingly simple for what it does. And as you can see in the image, we just showed that again with the like blocks, moving them less than a pixel, or at least mimicking moving them less than a pixel. And then we started working on another method of increasing the accuracy of the speckle tracking. So one of the challenges with the cross correlation method, if you are using the static type, as Brandon mentioned before, is that you can only accurately get movement within your window. So one of the other ways to solve this, besides moving the window, is to continuously do this iteratively with different sized blocks, and use that information that you gain at those higher levels to inform where you're probably going to be located at with those smaller and smaller blocks. So we can start out with these very large windows, knowing that the tissue definitely isn't moving farther than whatever those starting windows are, and move down to very, very small blocks, still allowing us to get that accuracy that we're looking for, but allows us to do so moving much farther away from what we could have done if we were not implementing this multi-level block method. And in the next slide, you can see how much this improves. It allows us to get much higher density information, which is helpful because when we're actually going to go calculate the strain, we are taking an average within the region. Yeah, so next, Brandon will talk about how to actually get strain from the displacement vectors.
Okay, so there's a few different like kind of definitions of strain, but sort of the classical physical definition would be the difference in the change in the length of something divided by the original length. So this is what's actually generally used for measuring the longitudinal strain for the heart. The difficulty with ultrasound is that it's very difficult to actually determine what the length of some part of the heart is, so, or like basically any size, because the borders are just blurred, right? It's like not really a really clearly defined border. And so that kind of fails generally in ultrasound. And so the idea of the speckle tracking method is that the strain that you see with two sub windows of speckle should be a contributor to the total strain. And so you can actually determine the like kind of local strain here by looking at two sub windows of strain, of speckle, and determining the distance between them in the like some initial frame. And then in another frame, you look at the displacement that they had and then determine where their new location of those patches of speckle is. And then you can actually calculate the new length there and determine that local strain value. And so that's generally the method that's used to calculate the strain from speckle. Is you calculate all of these and then do a bunch of averaging over basically a bunch of windows, a bunch of frames, and you can get those values. So now we're going to talk about like kind of our results and our implementation, and then some of our like challenges that we faced. So one of the things that's a little bit challenging with a MATLAB implementation of this is actually like determining these regions. So one of the things that we have to do is isolate 16 regions to calculate strain in, which if you want to hard code that for every different person isn't the best. And so we actually wound up implementing a full like kind of GUI to control all of this, just because it makes it a lot simpler. So what we implemented was the ability to draw rectangular regions. We found that it was a little bit too much to handle to do fancier shapes than that. But we figured that you can get a good enough approximation of the region that you're interested in with a rectangle, just because we're not actually measuring like the length of it or anything like that. And so we can draw a rectangular region on the image itself to isolate a region that then gets broken down, and then it calculates the strain for it. We also made some other features of it where you can change parameters for the speckle tracking and recalculate, see how it changes. You can see all of the speckle tracking vectors on the images and flip through them. And then you can also include multiple views. So what happens is that you can't get all 16 regions from the same view. And so you need to include usually 3 different views to get all of those 16 regions. And so we are able to add multiple views for a particular patient, and it keeps track of all of the regions, and then we can produce plots for them. So we implemented this, and we found that our results were not terrific, but we have some theories for what's going on. So what it should look like. So we were using data that Professor McVeigh provided us, where we have a comparison with the CT. So for reference, that we should be getting plots that look like this for the strain in each region. And this is actually pretty close to what we got for some of the regions. But then in others, it seems to have this pattern of just dropping off. And our current theory for what's actually happening, because we did test this, we did somewhat like a ton of testing with different methods and like changing the window size, and we couldn't quite get it to match. And so kind of the theory is that, and I kind of have some of this information on one of the later slides, but so far the theory that we have for why it's not matching is that the vectors that we get out of the displacements, the displacement calculations, they wind up getting a bunch of different directions, which is not necessarily an issue. But when you're averaging it, it kind of messes it up a little bit. And generally the motion of the heart, like the myocardium, is not in random directions. It's like it's kind of more uniform than that. And so something that we have learned about is that there's some smoothing operations that you could do. And we did some testing with it and it didn't quite work. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But yeah, so our results look like this at the moment. We did get similar results, which makes us think that it's doing something right. We think it's pretty close to working. And we're just not. We really don't know like what's going on.
I think when you see commercial packages that do this measurement using speckle, what they do is they do a heck of a lot of interpolation, right? So where they have data that is well supported by, say, really good, confident detection of speckle and displacements, they'll fill in other places that they just don't have data, right? So you can see on yours, there are certain places where it gets going, and then it probably just doesn't have any data to turn the darn thing around, right? It's just like, whatever.
Right.
So yeah, I think this looks like you've got good support in some locations and not much in others. And so specifically when the heart has reached end systole and opens up, it opens up with a much higher velocity. And so probably the tracking is having a hard time keeping up, like when it's opening. This would be my suggestion. I don't know though.
Okay. Yeah.
I have a
So I mean, we do
simple-
think that.
Sorry, I had a simple question. What is the x-axis here? That's not frame, is it?
It is framed.
It is frames.
Okay.
It is frames.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
So this is actually correct. Like this like general shape is correct. So we think that it's like the speckle tracking is at least working. Like, and also the general trends for the first half, it almost always seems to be correct. Which it should be getting more negative. So we just don't know what's going on when it's supposed to be turning around. But like you said, I think that does make sense. And then also potentially when it's like hitting zero, like kind of stopping the motion, could also be maybe messing with it a little bit. So we're not really sure what's going on. We tried a lot of different things and couldn't quite get like perfect results, but that's also part of what makes ultrasound a challenge, I think.
So this result was from a single patient in, and like when you watch the movie itself, you could probably get an idea of why it was hard at end systole to have this thing turn around and give you vectors going the opposite direction, right? It probably a lot of the features just go away or something, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the main weaknesses of using like the cross correlation as a determination for this is that when the tissue crunches up really close together, it loses a lot of the patterns that it was initially tracking.
Right.
So with the our method, one of the things that we did was if we get really low correlation, we just get rid of the data point.
Right.
So if the tissue crunches too much, we just lose a lot of our data points, unfortunately.
Right.
And this was something that we probably shouldn't have attempted to do. But if you go to the robust smoothing slide, we were sort of concerned that using this robust smoothing method would be sort of like overly smoothing our data. And so this is an example, same exact displacement fields where we just applied like the robust smoothing that is generally used. And you can see it very much changes the data. So we were trying to not use this method, but we probably sort of overcommitted to trying to avoid it. It was probably necessary, and we probably should have tried to.
I think it's necessary to smooth a lot.
Yeah.
When you see people doing this on commercial packages, it's obvious that a lot of smoothing is going on, right? So, I mean, just look at the random, arrows in the unsmooth data. It's, the general trend is there, but there's a lot of variability local.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think we just talked about pretty much all these challenges. And when we were looking at the results, so I'm going to skip over this slide. So if you don't mind, we can do the live demo.
Yeah, sure. If you got a couple minutes.
Okay. Okay. And then thank you again for the data. Unfortunately, our results weren't good enough quite to make good comparisons to the CT. But it was definitely useful to have like all the different views for patients, which was kind of a feature that we were trying to implement. So it was nice to have at least that part of the data. yeah, thank you again, and then thank you to everyone that was like kind of on the other end helping us get the data as well. Okay, let me share my other screen.
It's a good data set. We have, you know, see, I think they're within hours of each other, the CT and the ultrasound.
So we have this main. So for every patient, you basically run the code, and you get this main window where you can select a file. So I'm gonna go and select one of the views. I'm gonna choose a 2-chamber view. You can manually input the scale. We had some issues actually converting the DICOMs to nifties.
Oh yeah.
I think you can actually get this from the DICOM. But we didn't really implement that just because we wanted the possibility, like we wanted to leave it so that you could input either a DICOM or a Nifty file.
Yep.
And I don't think the Nifty would have that. So we just made this like a manual thing. So then you create the view, and then it pops up with a figure that has the first frame on the left as a reference for when you're moving through it, and then the right one will change. So just to show that functionality, you can cycle through it with the slider here. So what we did is we allowed you to draw a region. You can draw a rectangle. So I'm just going to draw like an arbitrary one here. You can name it, but I'm just gonna do this quick. And then you can choose the size of your sub windows, and then how much they overlap, which are just the main parameters that we had. We also have the different methods for tracking, and then you can add the region, and it calculates all of the stuff that it needs, and it does a lot of all the plotting. So you can hide and you can toggle like the plots and make them visible or not visible, depending on what you want to see.
And so now it's done the displacements in that blue box you just.
Yeah, so it's calculated all the speckle displacements in that box.
Okay.
Just because you can't plot 7,000 vectors on MATLAB, it gets mad at you. At least like when we're trying to flip through frames, because it also would be 7,000 times the number of frames, which is I think too much for it to handle really. So just to go through it, you can see the speckle tracking here with the vectors, and it shows on all the frames, and so you can keep adding regions, and then just to show that you can add more views, I will add another view. Comes up with one of these and one of these every time.
Cool.
We thought that this would be the best way to add regions and like be able to have control over that without having to hard code it. So even though it like so you know, ideally this could maybe be a method of using MATLAB for this, because it does have it, so you can like change the function to calculate everything.
Yeah, they in a commercial package, you would, instead of drawing a box there, you would draw a contour on what you believed was the endocardium and what you believed was the epicardium. And then it would, you know, pick off points from inside there.
Yeah. I think we were going to do that. We played around with contours and it just wound up being too complicated to implement, because you have to divide it into windows, and it's not rectangular necessarily. So it makes it a little bit challenging to get rectangular windows. I'm just gonna add another. Yeah.
Oh, this is cool. This is a really, did you write, or did you take this from something else, or did you write it from scratch, all of this?
No, we wrote all of this from scratch because we needed it.
This is really slick.
Yeah, this is pretty cool. I've never seen anyone do something as nice in MATLAB. Students, we always are hacking away at the command line, right? And that's pretty cool.
And I just want to have the second view available so that I can show the kind of last part of it, which was that we can So you can choose which region is applied to each of these. I only have 2 at the moment, so I'm just gonna do those 2. And then you can hit this button and it generates the plots.
Oh, that's cool.
Which again are not quite correct, but and it also creates the bullseye. For some reason, we did take the function for this from somebody. It is for some reason rotated kind of weird.
Yeah.
It's like rotated like 30 degrees for some reason, but
it's 90 degrees rotated, I think. I think inferior should be at 6 o'clock, right? So some that's really cool. All right. Maybe hang on to this or put it on GitHub or something, because so people could build off and maybe not even strain, but other stuff they might want to look at DICOM stuff with MATLAB, because most of the time you're just you're kind of stuck. Oh, that's great. All right, cool. I think one of the things that comes out is now viscerally, from firsthand experience, how tough it is to actually make precise quantitative measurements from echocardiography, right?
Yeah.
You expect, when you look at the movies, you expect it will be accurate and simple, right? Because when you watch a movie, an echo movie, you think, oh, I know what's going on. But your brain is tricking you, right? It's doing all of these interpolations that you've learned to do just as a human. And that's why, if you gave me the choice of brilliant PhD physics people doing lots of quantitative measurements, or this 68-year-old cardiologist looking at your echo, just looking at it, I'll take the 68-year-old cardiologist, right? Because the data is really tough when you get down to the level you guys are looking at it. And but the dynamic data in a human brain it's pretty good. It's really, that's why it's still around. That's why echo's done a lot, right? And that's why when you see how echo is done, it's always shipped to the back room, and there's some echo shaman who's been reading echoes forever, who looks at it and goes, oh, this is what's happening in that case, and they might put a cursor on here or there, but probably not. I mean, I'll guarantee you that Tony DeMaria, who's one of the senior cardiologists here, and he's been an echo guy for 50 years or something. I bet you he can get your ejection fraction to within 2% just by looking at it, right? Not by measuring things in volumes, but just looking at that echo. Like, that echo, that's a 38% ejection fraction. He'd be able to do it plus or minus 2%. So it's a very interesting state of affairs. Whereas other modalities, particularly CT, a lot of features are easily segmentable, right? Or will be as deep learning gets better. And so they're better for those precise things, but echo's still good for a human reader, I think. Well, that's great. Okay, so that's all the projects, and as usual, good work. I think we're done for the course. All the problem sets are handed in. There, we skipped problem set 5. Sorry about that, but I'll post up the solutions to that. So if you did it, you can take a look. And if you have any questions, if your work is in medical imaging, or you come across some imaging stuff in your research, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. And I can put you in touch with somebody who knows that field, or I can try and take a shot at myself to help you out. Also, if you get an email from, I forget who it comes from, but it comes from somewhere official UCSD thing to do the review of the course, I think it's a questionnaire. Please do that, because that, everybody looks at those. And you know, it's been a pleasure. Hope, sorry, I got so sick at the beginning of this class. It was terrible. I could hardly lecture, but we made it through anyway. So, all right, great. You guys have a fantastic summer, right? And
Do we need to submit anything?
say that
for
again.
The project. Do we need to submit
Well,
anything for the project?
ideally, yeah. Thanks for reminding me. That's good, Brandon. If you could submit your slides after the discussions I just had about annotating them, so that if there's a figure and you've taken it from paper, just paste the paper in there so we know where it came from. And this is being recorded, so I'll post up the recording of the presentations. But it's fine just to submit the slides for your project. If also you do want to submit that software, you can give a link to GitHub, or you can just, send me a link to the code, and that'd be great. Okay. Cool. All right. See you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You.
Have a great summer. Okay.